هذول كلهم. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to welcome you at this symposium entitled The Ukrainian Crisis, Reasons, Implications. Indeed, we are organizing this symposium to discuss the major crisis that is being called as the Ukrainian crisis, and some thought that this might lead to a third world war and perhaps go back to the Cold War. We shall be addressing the implications of the Ukrainian crisis, starting from the issues of the two nations, Russia and Ukraine, starting from the annexation of Crimea in 2014 and the pursuit of the Ukraine to get to the NATO, to become a member of the NATO, and the United States of America's intervention in this dossier, along with China and others. The Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies is interested in scrutinizing this crisis and trying to envisage the implications thereby, whether we shall see a settlement or a war. We shall wait and see. We have three papers or three interventions, three prominent experts, Dr. Marwan Kabalan and Dr. Nikolay Kozhanov and Dr. Daniel Bromberg, who is joining us from Washington, D.C. or New York, I'm not sure. And as we said, to a certain extent, we shall be tackling the different dimensions. And as you know, yesterday, Mr. Putin has declared his recognition of the independence of the two self-proclaimed republics, Lugansk and Donetsk. And things are rolling, and we shall see further developments. We hope that we will spend 1.5 hours to 2 hours, and every gentleman will have 20 minutes. We'll start with our colleague, Mr. Marwan Kabalan, the head of the unit of political policies, and he will be talking to us. And as I said, the allotted time is 20 minutes. Please, the floor is yours. Thank you, Dr. Haider. And I know the allotted time perhaps is tight, and we are about to finish the working day, and we have a guest from the United States of America, and it's in the very early hours in there, so we'd like to welcome him. And as you know, the crisis has been developing hour by an hour, and I would like to answer 5 main questions. I think that some of them might cover the crisis and perhaps the future developments. The 5 questions that I would like to answer. First, why Ukraine is important and why it is in the midst of this crisis. What's the history of the crisis itself, and why it has flared up now? What are the objectives of Mr. Putin? Has he miscalculated? What are the prospects of war and peace, and who are the winners and losers? As a matter of fact, the Ukraine is a marginal kind of country, or perhaps it is on the periphery, and it comes from the root term, the Slavic root term, periphery. And as you know, it had been under the control of the Germanic, the Polish, the Russian, also the Ottoman empires, and it has been divided between Poland, Russia, and in the 19th century, Russia and the Habsburg family divided it, and then it became under the wing of the Soviet Union. So the Ukraine has become an independent country in 1991 following the dissolution of the USSR, and Russia did not accept such independence because Mr. Putin has been skeptic in its legitimacy. In last July, there was an article Mr. Putin has written and talked about the unity between the two nations, and yesterday he emphasized this when he recognized the independence of the two breakaway regions, Lugansk and Donetsk. And he said that the Ukraine is a Russian kind of invention, and he blamed Mr. Stalin and Mr. Khrushchev because they allowed the emergence of the Ukraine, because he considers it as part of Russia, especially when Kievsky Rus has emanated from Kiev. There is also another side of the issue that relates to the geopolitics, its location and the security implications thereby, especially in the East or in the West. In 1994, I would like to underscore this, it agreed to disarm and in return of its independence and what we call the Budapest document. And Mr. Zelensky has threatened that he shall withdraw from it because Russia has not abided by the document. Could you ask the gentleman to slow down because we cannot follow him? Please, could you ask him to slow down? We cannot, the interpreters cannot follow him. This is a map on the Washington Post, and it explains the development of the Ukraine up until 1820. And it illustrates the expansion of Russia. And could you get closer to the microphone as well, please? Thank you. I'd like to answer the following question: why the Ukraine is important? It is the second in size after Russia, and if we exclude Russia, Ukraine is the biggest in Europe, and as you know, it has 40 million inhabitants, and it has the second army in the Europe as far as the number of the troops are concerned. It is third as far as the wheat exporting abilities, and its army is 10th as far as strength is concerned. When it comes to Russia, the Ukraine is very important from the Russian perspective because it has resembled a security and geopolitical complex. As you know, on two occasions, the Ukraine has constituted a transit area for the French invasion at the time of Napoleon Bonaparte in 1812 and the Nazis later in 1941. Following the Second World War, Moscow was keen on having a buffer zone between Russia and Europe, especially Germany and France. However, after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, Ukraine has become more important. And here I'm talking about the Warsaw Accord and Belarus. The Ukraine also had the command of the Russian Navy in Sevastopol, and the Ukraine did not want to renew the contract of having anything to do with the Russians in Sevastopol at that period. This is the Warsaw Alliance, and as you see on the screen, you can see it had included most of the countries that are now members of the NATO, as illustrated in the second map. Here you can see the red color, and in the second screen you can see the blue color that illustrates the expansion of NATO following its enlargement. This map illustrates the fact that there are two countries only, Belarus and the Ukraine, that have not acceded to the NATO yet. And Serbia is not a member. Bosnia and Herzegovina is not also a member. Austria also is neutral. It has not acceded NATO. In addition to that, Russia considers the Ukraine as part of its culture, especially in the east, because they speak Russian, and Mr. Putin has allocated 30 minutes to talk about culture and history in his speech yesterday. Ukraine represents also the Eurasian unity, and it is an economic and a political unity. Kazakhstan, the Ukraine, Russia, and the Ukraine. The Ukraine is the most important member because without the Ukraine, the Eurasian Union would disintegrate. However, the Ukraine has left in May 2014, and Russia as well is a transit area for the gas to pass. As far as the geopolitics is concerned, Mr. Brzezinski has said that Russia with the Ukraine is a superpower. However, Russia without the Ukraine is just an Asian country. So in the Budapest summit in 2008, there were attempts to have the Ukraine a member of the NATO. And as I said, it is an economic transit country. It has 40 million inhabitants, and Germany, as you know, has played a major role in regards of the enlargement of the NATO. So the Europeans want the Ukraine to become under the umbrella of the EU, and Russia wants the Ukraine to become under the umbrella of the Eurasian unity. As you know, Mr. Yanukovych has retreated from signing the association agreement with the EU, and thus things have changed, and Mr. Yanukovych has left, and 8 years ago Mr. Zelensky came to power. As far as the roots of the crisis is concerned, I'd like to say that the crisis is represented in two issues. First and foremost is the pursuit of democratization. Mr. Putin believes that spreading democracy is one of the challenges, and he spoke about this issue when he interfered in Kazakhstan, when people took to the streets against Tokayev. And there's a geopolitical also element that relates to the enlargement of the NATO. It has started, the problem has started with the Orange Revolution. The West played a major role in the revolution and also in Kyrgyzia and in Georgia. At the time, Mr. Putin wanted to stop the enlargement of the NATO, and indeed the Ukraine represented the underbelly of Russia, and we do understand that there were waves of enlargement of the NATO eastwards, and most importantly in 1999, because major countries in Eastern Europe, Hungary, the Czech Republic, acceded, as well as the Baltic regions acceded to NATO, in addition to Bulgaria, Slovenia, Slovakia, As you know, the Czech Republic has been part and parcel of Czechoslovakia and other countries. The major struggle manifested itself when the NATO wanted for Georgia and the Ukraine to become members. Mr. Putin has invaded Georgia just 4 months after that event, and after his lost the Ukraine in 2014, in the Ukraine 2010 wanted his allies to come to the helm of power, and as you know, later on Zelensky came along and a problem started. There were attempts to solve this problem through the OCSC and the Normandy format, as you know, played a role here. And unfortunately, all these formats did not get us anywhere. There were two major events in 2020, 2021. Mr. Zelensky has a decree to have a partnership agreement with the NATO as a step, and it was a unilateral step on the part of the Ukraine in March 2021. Mr. Zelensky wanted for the Donbass to be reintegrated and for the occupation in the Crimea to be fought. In June, with the Ukraine, we had witnessed maneuvers. But in October, as you know, the Russians had their full heavy weight with the troops amassing. So the crisis goes back to different issues and a number of years, but Mr. Putin thinks that the interests of Europe in the region has become limited, and thus Washington wouldn't take heed of what takes place in the Ukraine. And Mr. Putin thinks that Mr. Biden is weak, internally speaking, in the United States of America because of the political division that the USA is living by. Especially following the Afghanistan withdrawal and the corona, the pandemic, and the economic situation, and so on and so forth. Also, Mr. Putin had the Black Sea in mind, and the NATO, following the chaotic withdrawal of the USA from Afghanistan, the NATO has become somewhat weaker, or has lost some confidence, some trust. Also, there is the energy element. Mr. Putin thought that this might drive a wedge between the Europeans, because Europe is starving and as far as the gas is concerned. And he also thought of the immigration waves that might overwhelm the continent. Well, the gentleman is speaking too fast. Unfortunately, I have to alarm him, because otherwise we wouldn't be able to interpret.
In my opinion, has Putin made a mistake in his calculations or not? He succeeded in pushing the West into negotiating with him. We saw almost all Western leaders rushing to meet him, and we will see what will happen in the next few days after some time of ignoring him. But I think Putin made a mistake in his calculations, because Biden has managed to bring together an alliance which no other previous president managed to do so, and the United States played a major role in this. The importance of NATO has increased despite Putin's attempt to blackmail them. And in the latest NATO meeting in Brussels, this was noticeable. NATO's presence on the borders or near the borders of Russia has increased. And what Putin didn't want to happen has probably happened as a result of his miscalculations. And also the position taken by President Putin has pushed some countries which were not thinking of joining the NATO alliance, and even some of the neutral countries started thinking of doing so to enhance their security. And also Ukraine's insistence has increased on its theory that its security will rely on joining the NATO. Also, alternative energy sources has been of the issue lately, and now even there is more talk than before about using energy as a weapon. Also, Russia's banking on China taking a more proactive position in support has failed. Why? Because the Chinese foreign minister has reiterated his country's upholding the principle of protecting the sovereignty and the integrity of the territorial integrity of all countries. Also, there was some sort of an opinion when Putin moved some of his troops from the from the Siberian front to Eastern Europe. There was no prior or de facto understanding with China over that prior to the move. And finally, Putin's mistake is when he sort of excluded millions of pro-Russian voters from the electoral register in the Ukraine. The question now about whether or not war will happen, Russia doesn't seem to be preparing for a major war. The indications are not as such so, and despite yesterday's recognition of the independence of the two separatist nations, I think this is an attempt by Putin to climb down from a very high tree. He climbed up and he was stuck there for a while. And also he didn't in fact get much of the things he wanted. He didn't get any promises that the Ukraine will not be allowed to join NATO. And I think he was in a crisis. He was heading fast towards more sanctions being imposed on his country, and he wanted a solution as a face-saving formula before his people. So he chose this step to show his own people that he has done something, he has accomplished something, he has managed to put the West vis-a-vis a hard situation, hard choices, and the threat of sanctions that the Americans spoke about, and the American position was clear since 2014, and the only new development was this recognition. I think today we must carefully watch the American position today and tomorrow, to see how will the Americans react to this latest decision by Putin, and whether or not we will see a Russian invasion, a partial or full one. Finally, who are the winners and the losers? The biggest winner is the United States. They managed to rally around their position a vast array of nations. Maybe the U.S. has managed to wipe out the bad image created by its chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan. Biden can claim that he's deterred Putin so far from invading the Ukraine. If Russia invades, then the United States will say they managed to stand up to him to the last minute, and my colleague Nikolai will speak in more detail about this. The second winner is Turkey, in my opinion, because Turkey played a role, and it managed to emphasize its role as an active member of the NATO alliance, and managed to edge a little bit closer to Russia, and consolidated its position with the West. Iran is a winner too. It finds in this crisis an opportunity to speak about providing energy supplies as an alternative to Russian gas. And also we are in the last minutes of restoring the nuclear deal, and Iran is hoping to get some investment in the derelict sector, energy sector in Iran, and because Europe may have to rely less on the Russian gas supplies and turn its attention to Iran maybe. And finally, the losers, I think the Ukraine will be the losers, because they are turned into a battlefield ground between the East and the West. Europe will lose because they have to find alternatives to the Russian gas supplies and do something on the security. And there will be renewed attention to the energy markets and the Russian supplies, and maybe Europe will turn more to the Asian supplies or the Gulf supplies, or there may be some kind of switch. Russia will be providing the Eastern Asian countries, the Gulf may be providing the European countries. This is an important issue, and I think also countries which rely on the oil and gas heavily, if the prices goes up, they too will be losers. I think this is all what the time allows me to, and thank you for your kind attention. Thank you, Dr. Marwan, for your intervention. Now I move immediately to Dr. Nikolay Kozanov from Qatar University. He will be presenting the second. I know Dr. Kozanov is an economist and an expert in the field of energy. You two have 20 minutes.
Me to attend this event and to speak on the topic of energy market and how the interests of the Gulf states are going to be affected by the current global political crisis. And while preparing my speech, I was recalling how in 2015, when I was working in the Russia-Eurasia program of Chatham House, my then boss told me, why shouldn't you write an essay on how the Ukrainian crisis affects Russian approaches to the Middle East? And he told it a very rare chance when you can bind the Middle East with Eastern Europe and especially with the post-Soviet space. Well, I wish he was wrong. Since then, the situation that was unfolding around Russia, that was unfolding around Ukraine, and that was unfolding in the post-Soviet space, was often affecting not only a Russian presence in the region, but more global situation that in its turn has a direct impact on the interests of the Gulf states and first of all GCC member states, including their standpoint at the global oil and gas markets. And it's not surprised that the current intensification of tensions between Russia and the West, Russia and Ukraine, it created quite a lot of speculations on how this crisis is going to change the overall position of these countries at the hydrocarbon markets. We got quite a wide range of judgments, beginning from that these countries are not going to help Europe to diversify their energy security and their dependence on Russian supplies, and ending up with the strong beliefs that it is a gold moment for the Gulf countries to step in and to try to squeeze Russia out of oil and gas market. Well, we need to say that the truth is always somewhere in between, somewhere between these two versions. And in order to understand those scenarios that can unfold in the future, we need to first of all to adopt a comprehensive approach and to understand what are the main characteristics of current oil and gas markets and what are the drivers that are affecting them. First and foremost, we could say that the oil and gas markets are now heavily affected by three factors. It's first of all the ongoing impact of COVID on the balance between demand and supply. It is the impact of shale industry that against any predictions continue its revival and continue its growth. And finally, it's also the energy transition enigma. While some countries are trying to, and companies are trying to decrease their investments in the traditional oil and gas, the other countries are trying to actually to see whether they can exploit it as a possibility, as an option. And as a result, right now you could see quite a number of different market strategy implemented by the countries that are creating a substantial instability and uncertainty in the oil and gas markets of the world. Not saying that we see this market getting extremely competitive, where just one player cannot change and offset the overall situation, which makes even such organization as OPEC not as effective as it used to be and heavily needed to cooperate with the non-OPEC players, thus leading to the establishment of so-called OPEC Plus and creating quite a tight bond between Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates and Kuwait on one side and Russia as an oil producer on another side. We also see that right now this market is getting more, in terms of its export flow, Asia-oriented, with the United States emerging as an important oil and, first of all, natural gas exporter. All in all, these situations substantially limits options for predictability of, or for the creation of just one scenario for the development of events in the market. Even in such situation as the current conflict between Russia and the West, Russia and Ukraine. Additional unpredictability is added by the actual fact that we still don't know what the reaction of the world, and first of all, the United States and Europe is going to be on the events we have seen. Right now, we can outline three potential scenarios. First of all, the first possible scenario is the introduction of comprehensive sanctions that are going to hit Russian oil export. We're talking about oil embargo on the one hand, and Russian possibility to conduct trade operations through the exclusion Russia from the access to the SWIFT system. By the very beginning, I need to say that this scenario is considered to be least possible, but at the same time, it would probably be most effective in terms of putting pressure on Moscow, as it would exclude from the market at least 4 million barrels a day of Russian oil exported to Europe and the United States, and according to some assessments, up to 2 million barrels of semi-produced oil products, which, according to different assessments, represent up to 40–50% of Russian oil and crude export. Of course, this situation would have substantial impact on the market, and that's one of the main reasons why actually this scenario is considered as least possible. Because in the current situation, when basically we see the market still being far from achieving its balance between demand and supply, the prices on oil and oil products in this scenario would definitely be going up, as there is almost no producer that could be immediately to step in and to save the market from overheating by adding extra oil resources, which in the end would be not only in the interest of oil and gas consumers, but also it wouldn't be in the interest of, first of all, oil producers, because usually such a substantial increase in oil prices, they immediately ends up, or at least in the short run, they can end up in the overheating of the market and the substantial drop down in prices. So the second scenario, which is again, depends on how the situation is going to develop. But it's more possible. So if we see the continuation of the confrontation, and especially its military phase. But in this situation, as if we exclude the adoption of the comprehensive sanctions, we will most probably will see the losses in the oil market in terms of Russian supply, mostly connected to the military activities. And in these cases, the losses are going to be quite small. So if we assess the pipelines that can be in risk, we are mostly talking about up to 6,100 barrels a day, which is almost nothing for the market. In terms of the natural gas supply, if we take into account the nominal volume of natural gas that can currently be going from Russia to Europe via Ukraine, it's about 40 billion cubic meters, but it's a nominal value right now. The volumes are twice lower, and most of them they can be compensated through the active exploitation of Yamal pipeline. So in this situation, we would say that immediate and direct impact on the oil market will be quite minimal. But this scenario, as well as the third potential option, is business as usual. So when we don't see any substantial cuts, apart from, of course, I forgot to mention the freezing of the implementation of Nord Stream 2 project. In all three scenarios, this project is crossed out. From reality, the main losses that Russia may have, and that can be inevitably affecting the oil and gas market, they are mostly connected to the sanctions, again, that affects Russia's ability to maintain its oil production sector. So mostly we're talking about the exports of spare parts that could help Russia to maintain oil output and to develop existing oil and gas fields, which even without the sanctions is quite a serious task. So we might see that in the long run, if sanctions are implemented and if the confrontation continues, we will see Russia losing its capacities as an oil producer probably faster than it was expected before. So under these circumstances, what are the gains and what are the losses of the Gulf producers in this crisis? So in the short-term scenario, in the short run, let's say within a year or two, we would probably won't see any substantial and immediate gains happening. If we take an example of the LNG gas market, and of course the interests of Qatar, we would see that, like in the case of oil producers, the main focus of Qatar is on Asia. European market is less appealing, both in terms that it offers to the suppliers and both in terms of its prospects, because the main growth of demand is in natural gas is largely associated with Asia, and definitely right now in the current conditions of heavy and active competition between other producers, including the United States, including Australia in the Asian market, diverting flows from Asia to Europe, if there is no extra additional motivation, is not in the interest of the producers, as in the future it might end up in them losing certain share of their market. Not to say that the majority of existing volumes that Qatar could export to Europe, they could come only through the revision of existing contracts. And even if we take into account existing volumes that still could be diverted from Asia, which is assessed in between 5 to 11 billion cubic meters, as compared to the volume of Russian exports to the European market, it will help Qatar just slightly rise its share in European imports from 5 to 7.2%, maybe 7.5%, maybe less. OPEC scenario is also not giving certain hopes for the OPEC members to replacing Russia as an oil supplier to Europe or helping Europeans to diversify their relations. First of all, we have right now serious concerns about the capacities of the OPEC countries and their ability to match the nominal production they declared. So, for instance, even in case of Saudi Arabia, that formally is expected to being able to produce up to 11 million barrels a day, according to other estimates, it aims for 12 million barrels with the potential to go as high as 13. The real capacities, due to existing technical problems, might be in reality way low, up to 10.5 million barrels. All in all, together with United Arab Emirates, together with existing production dynamics within OPEC itself, we don't see these countries being able immediately to produce enough volumes to replace Russia if needed. Not to say that there are also certain rules inside the OPEC itself that prohibit the members, and the recent events, they clearly show that, to prohibit the members of OPEC from exploiting existing political situation against their colleagues within this organization, or exploiting even technical limitations that some of the countries might face in terms of increase or decrease their production, in order to gain the share of the market at the expense of other participants. The Iranian factor is also under big question. Let me not to concentrate too much on the political aspects of future agreement, but even in terms of the real volumes that this country can deliver, again, it's not a salvation in itself. So what we could say that right now Iran can bring to the market not more than 1 million barrels a day. And again, the question is whether Europe is going to be the most preferred market, and whether actually Iran will be willing to export its oil rather than to use it for the needs of the petrochemical industry in order to increase the volume of those incomes it can receive in the future. So, sorry for drawing the dark picture of European energy security, but everything is not as bad as may seem. Actually, in the long run, the opportunities for the Gulf countries to become one of the important elements in the European energy security, they are way higher. What Russia is doing right now through its attempt to use its natural resources as an economic weapon, as a weapon to press its neighbors and its traditional consumers, Russia is basically creating a huge mistake, because it's changing not even the current situation in the market, but it is changing the behavior of consumers. And this is something which is not related to pure economic, when you can measure the immediate effect by just comparing figures as I was doing it right now. It's mostly about creating the psychological model of behavior. So that means that Russia is not going to be trusted as it was before. And that means that basically Russia is creating itself a necessary ground for European countries to look for potential alternatives, even if they are going to be more expensive, but they would like to see them more reliable. And in this situation, this intention has already been slowly exploited by the Gulf countries. Here I need to say one more comment about the short-term situation. We also need to keep in mind the political factor of relations between Russia and GCC. Russia is considered to be as important player in the Middle East due to its involvement in quite a number of political issues. So for now there is no signal on Qatari side or on Saudi side or on Emirati side that they would like to openly exploit this political situation and their needs. So what they would like to do is to present the entry in the European market, even if it's created by the political conditions, by the Russian misbehavior, as still a business affair. So in order to not to irritate Moscow excessively. And that's what we have been watching since the annexation of Crimea in 2014. We have seen how gradually both Saudi Arabia and Qatar are increasing their presence in Eastern Europe. It's done slow, but since 2014 we, for instance, have seen substantial increase in supplies of Qatari LNG to Poland, and active attempts to enter Eastern Europe, not saying that somehow, well, it's not surprising given what's happening right now in the world and in Europe. We missed one important deal that was signed between Saudi Aramco and Polish companies that allowed Poland not simply to increase the exports of their oil to this country threefold, from roughly 100,000 barrels a day to 300,000, but also to gain an access to the petrochemical and refinery infrastructure of Poland, and potentially also Czech and Slovakian Republic. If I'm not mistaken about Slovakia, I need to double check. And this is the trend that will continue. So we also will see definitely the LNG infrastructure is changing in Europe, creating much more opportunities for LNG exporters to access the European market. And moreover, right now we might expect that those countries like Germany, who doesn't have LNG infrastructure, will be interested either in creation their own or in elimination of those production bottlenecks that are existing in these countries. The obstacle for the improvement of these relations and cooperation between GCC and Europe is also connected to a number of technical aspects rather than political, I would say, in the long run. So GCC will definitely ask from the Europeans better conditions from their oil and gas exports. And that has already been done by the Qatari leadership. From this point of view, Europe will definitely, in order to profit from the capacities of these countries to export, will need to make certain amendments and changes in its own approaches of how the oil and gas market inside of Europe is regulated. To conclude, in the short run, the effect of the current crisis on the interests of the Gulf countries in the oil and gas market will be limited. But in the long run, we should not exclude them from the list of those players that can help European Union to diversify its energy security and go away from sole dependence on Putin's regime. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bishop.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kozhanov, for this intervention where you've spoken about the economic implications of the crisis. Now we'll move to the last intervention from our guest, Mr. Daniel Bromberg from the USA, from George Washington, Washington, D.C., and he's joining us by Zoom. And the gentleman will be talking about the American stance and the implications thereby on some other dossiers. Dr. Bloomberg, can you hear us? No. Please go ahead.
20
Thank
minutes.
you. Well, good afternoon to everybody on this, I suppose, potentially historic day. I mean, I think it has to be said that what is going on in Ukraine is going to be perhaps the defining moment diplomatically of this century. And Putin has, I think, both won and lost. Simultaneously, he's lost because he's not going to get the concessions he demanded from the West, but he's being forced to take a much more aggressive stand by his own position on his own negotiating position, put him in a corner, and now he finds himself compelled to escalate. And I think we're just seeing the beginning of this, and it's going to sort of have ripple effects, obviously, throughout the region, the Middle East, and the world, and in U.S. politics. I've been asked to focus on the U.S.-Iran dimension and the ongoing talks in Vienna, which coincidentally look like they're coming to some sort of conclusion with the possibility of a deal. It's very difficult to speculate what's going on behind closed doors and how the crisis in Ukraine is affecting these things. But before I say a few things about that, and I'm going to keep my remarks relatively short because I think we're running out of time, it has to be noted that here in the United States, the crisis has given Biden an opportunity to demonstrate his leadership, particularly in the wake of the Afghanistan withdrawal, to demonstrate that he can rally Europe and to sort of reconstitute U.S. leadership to some extent in Europe and elsewhere, and that is an important sort of factor. It doesn't seem to have the kind of domestic echo effect that you might assume, because for the Republicans still under the grip of a kind of populist movement, Republican leaders, quite a few of them have simply said that what happens in Ukraine doesn't really affect American interests. So that plus the possibility of rising inflation due to the effects on the markets, and as our colleague just noted, this is not a purely market issue, this is a psychological issue, and it really is the psychology of the situation that drives prices in the short term. If this adds to more inflation, this is going to be bad news for Biden. So to translate what's going on diplomatically into a political gain on the domestic front, it's not going to be an obvious process for him. But nevertheless, he is finding himself in a moment of leadership that to some extent was given to him as a gift by Putin, if only because Putin overplayed his hand and now is finding himself probably undertaking measures that he might have otherwise preferred to avoid. As far as the implications for, I think there are sort of two things to keep in mind. In the big picture, the decision by Putin to basically negate Ukrainian sovereignty and to go in there is going to really concentrate the minds of all the Middle East players as they watch, and that includes the Iranians, as they watch this unfold. We've already seen, by the way, that China, despite the recent meeting between Putin and the Chinese leader, has basically said that the sovereignty of nations is a global principle, and they believe in it. And so even the Chinese may find themselves unhappy ultimately with the Russian behavior, and concerned about the implications of China's own economic interests for Chinese behavior, for Russian behavior. So it's really a telling moment, and it may, in fact, we've seen an effort by Turkey and Israel to renew relations. We've seen Erdogan recently in the UAE. Even economically and politically, this may accelerate efforts at sort of regional, implicit alliance making, the likes of which we wouldn't have anticipated only a few short months ago, if we consider Erdogan's invitation to the Israeli president that looks like it's going to happen next month. So it's an extraordinary moment, and it's getting a lot of the players to sort of rethink their positions in ways that we perhaps wouldn't have anticipated had Putin not overplayed his hand. So I think that's the first thing, and it's hard to predict what the outcome of this will be, but precisely for reasons that have to do with the economy and the desire of Gulf states to step in and provide Europe and Germany in particular with this resources that it will lose. Germany has already said that it's not going to go through with the Nord Stream pipeline. It's really quite a moment. As far as the U.S.-Iran context is concerned, I think that my guess is, knowing Rob Malley as I do, he's somebody who has extraordinary powers of concentration and determination. He already basically secured the departure of a number of members of the American negotiating team who may have objected to the way the negotiations were going. And I think he's going to push very hard, and the Iranians are going to push very hard for an agreement and are going to probably get there, although we can never say. But the reason why they're going to get there is really very simple, I think, and that is the alternative for the United States and Iran is worse. No agreement leads to the possibility that the U.S. will have to rely on some sort of policy of containment, which will not contain Iran's nuclear program at all, and or the possibility of a full-on military conflict with Iran. And that's something that Iran and the United States want to avoid. The Russians want to avoid it. The Chinese want to avoid it. Nobody wants really that. Everybody recognizes the implications for the region of a full-on conflict like that. And so to walk away from Vienna without an agreement is something that I think that all the parties wish to avoid. And so that if there's going to be an agreement, it's because the alternative is worse. And therefore, everybody has some incentive to arrive at some sort of compromise. The Iranians clearly 6-7 weeks ago overplayed the hand. They were making demands of the United States that they must have known were simply not acceptable to the U.S. And it's not unlikely, it's quite possible that they have, to some extent, backed away from some of these demands because of Russian and Chinese pressure. The Russians were the Russian government was explicitly quite critical of the Iranian position not too long ago, and kept asking for the Iranians to come up with a position and complaining that they hadn't really got their act together. So it's interesting that if there's been progress, it's possibly a consequence of the readiness of Russia and China to sort of push the Iranians to make some sort of compromises. And I think my guess is that the Russians are not going to use, I don't think the conflict in Ukraine is going to get the Russians to in any way push the Iranians now to sort of walk out of a deal. I doubt that it's going to happen. My guess is that to some extent they've built a reasonable firewall between what's going on in Vienna and what's going on in the Ukraine, believe it or not. And therefore, there's going to be some sort of agreement that will come out of this. Of course, it's been said already, for the Iranians, gas and oil is the engine of their economy. There's no future in nuclear energy that will solve their economic sort of problem. They need investment. They need the end of sanctions. They really have a huge interest in getting an agreement, and to whether or not the United States is leveraging that interest in ways that will produce an agreement acceptable in the U.S. context is obviously a big question. But I think an agreement will probably come out of it. I think the biggest obstacle to sort of what happens if there's an agreement is not so much in the Middle East, but here in Washington, D.C., because there's tremendous opposition on the Hill to any kind of agreement. There's a demand that this be signed as a treaty or some sort of agreement that the Congress will ultimately vote on. Resistance in both the Republican and to some extent Democratic parties could be quite strong. And of course, if there is an effort to undermine any kind of agreement here on the Hill, that just sort of returns us to square one. So the U.S. is going to try to get an agreement. The Iranians will try to get an agreement. Whether it can translate into something that's sustainable, I think, is a real open question. But ultimately, the events in Ukraine really have to give pause to all the players in the region. Russia has demonstrated a readiness to use the kind of force. Of course, they demonstrated it in Syria. There was no hesitation. But in the case of Ukraine, all the key players in the Middle East will start to sort of reconsider and are reconsidering sort of their sort of relationships in ways that may actually improve a degree of regional cooperation across the board, with perhaps to some extent, obviously Syria and to some extent Iran, but even Iran will look at this and shake their heads because the Iranians don't trust the Russians at all. So it's really a sort of it's an open moment, a moment of great transformation, uncertainty, and I'm not trying to sort of exit the challenge of a prediction, but it's very hard to know where this is going to go. But I think that an agreement in Vienna is more rather than less likely. Thank you.
شكرا. ثانك يو دكتور برومبرغ. شكرا دكتور برومبرغ على هذه المداخلة المكثفة.
Where you talked about the Ukrainian crisis and you've linked it to the Vienna negotiations and the American stance. We have to throw the floor open for questions and answers. Ladies and gentlemen, I'll open the floor. I have some questions through the social media. Some have asked about the Turkish role, but before that, I'll start. Allow me with His Excellency, the Ukrainian ambassador in Doha, Andrei Kozmenko, who has honored us. Please, Mike.
Audience, ladies and gentlemen, this is a great pleasure for me to be here and to discuss in the discussion regarding the Ukrainian issue at the Arabic Center. This shows the globalization of our society, interconnections between all the countries and interdependence. I understand that this is the academical discussion. This is not the political discussions. That is why let me make few academical remarks, if I may. I will start with methodology. First of all, I'm not in agreement with this title, Ukrainian crisis. This is even not the crisis between Ukraine and Russia. This is the crisis between Russia and the civilized countries, since Russia is no more belong to it. Why it is so? Let's continue the short remarks regarding these events. A fantastic presentation of the first distinguished speaker, but it seems to me for the next time it would be pertinent to use such an asset as the consultations with Ukrainian embassy, since we have a lot of information. And probably it will help not to use some Russian narratives which are quite spread in the historical literature, in academic literature, starting from the name Ukraine. In fact,